The last turn of the gravel road spat my old truck onto a desolate stretch of coastline, a place the maps called the Shroud. Fitting, I thought, as the sea mist, thick as spun cotton, clung to everything. It was late afternoon, but the sun was just a bruised memory behind the gray, churning sky. Above it all, a skeletal finger against the oppressive monochrome, stood the Whispering Spire. Inheritance. What a grim joke. My sister gone, and I was left with this, a crumbling monument to isolation and forgotten purpose. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. The ache in my chest was a constant companion these days, a dull throb that sometimes flared into a searing pain, mirroring the phantom limb of her absence. Coming here to this edge of the world was supposed to be a reset, a place where the silence might finally drown out the echoes of her laughter, her voice, everything I missed. The spire itself was more imposing than any photograph had conveyed. Blackened stone, crusted with salt and lichen, rose from a jagged promontory. It wasn't just old, it felt ancient, burdened with centuries. The wind, even from inside the truck, carried a low, mournful sigh that seemed to emanate from the very stone, earning the Lighthouse its ominous moniker. I cut the engine. The sudden quiet was profound, broken only by the shriek of gulls and the rhythmic boom of waves against the rocks below. Before I'd left the mainland, I'd made a point of stopping at the small, wind-battered general store in the nearest fishing village. "Grant, isn't it?" he'd asked, his voice raspy like dry sand. "Heard you were coming, another one." His gaze had lingered on me, sharp and assessing. "They say it takes hold, that place, takes hold of your thoughts. He was seen it happen. Keepers, they just faded or went staring at the horizon for too long, like the sea had stolen their wits." He tapped a gnarled finger against the counter. "Best to leave the past where it lies, lad. Some things are better off forgotten." I dismissed it then, of course. Superstition born of isolation and the relentless boredom of coastal life. I, Grant, a man of logic, of science, of empirical data. My maps didn't deal in phantoms. They dealt in measurable coordinates, in elevations and depths. I grabbed my bag, the weight of it familiar and grounding. The heavy wooden door of the lighthouse, swollen with damp and age, groaned in protest as I pushed it inward. Inside, the air was stagnant, thick with the smell of salt, mildew, and something else, a faint, metallic tang, like old pennies, overlaid with the cloying sweetness of decay. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a circular antechamber. Dust motes danced in the pale cone of light, ancient and undisturbed. The steps were worn smooth in the center, testament to countless feet that had ascended and descended, their journeys now swallowed by time. Watchful. I remembered an evening not long ago, hunched over a heavy, leather-bound tome in the prison library after hours. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sickly glow on the ancient texts I'd requested. I was researching the spire, meticulously trying to find any logical explanation for the disappearances, for the madness the locals spoke of. I found old shipping logs, meteorological reports, even a few faded newspaper clippings. One entry from a turn-of-the-century local paper described a keeper found muttering nonsense, drawing strange symbols on the walls of the lantern room before he simply vanished. Another, decades later, detailed how a family of keepers had gone, one by one, leaving behind only an empty, windswept shell. No bodies, no notes, just absence. The reports offered no scientific explanation, no logical cause. My logical mind had been frustrated, convinced there was a mundane answer buried beneath the sensationalism. They felt like presence. The wind outside, which I'd previously dismissed as just that, now seemed to carry a distinct, low murmur, as if a multitude of hushed voices were speaking just beyond the thick stone walls. Not the gulls, not the waves, something else. A constant, barely perceptible drone that vibrated through the floorboards, up through my boots, into my very bones. My sister's face, clear and vibrant, flashed in my mind. I pressed my lips together. No, this was just a dilapidated old building, a victim of time and neglect. I was here for solitude, for work, for a clean slate. I wouldn't let old wives' tales or my own sorrow unravel me. Not yet. I took another step, my boots scuffing on the gritty stone floor. The low murmur from the walls seemed to intensify for a fraction of a second, then faded back into the general drone, almost as if it had reacted to my movement. I paused, listening intently. Nothing. Just the wind, the sea, and the echoes of my own breath. I specialized in unveiling hidden things, in mapping the unknown, and I was going to map every inch of this place starting now. The spire loomed, a jagged tooth against the bruised sky, and I, Grant, a man who once believed only in what could be measured, felt a prickle of something beyond the empirical. Still, I pushed past it. Superstition, I'd told myself 1,000 times, was the refuge of idle minds. My mind was anything but idle. It was a cartographer's mind, precise and ordered. My initial days were a blur of strenuous, methodical labor. The lighthouse was a monument to neglect. Every surface was coated in a fine, gritty film that seemed to have settled for centuries. I dragged out tattered remnants of furniture, swept away layers of dried seabird guano, and scraped at peeling paint until my hands ached and blistered. The air, perpetually damp and smelling of salt and decay, clung to my clothes, to my skin, a constant reminder of the spire's isolation. I established a routine, a bulwark against the vast emptiness around me. Up before dawn, a simple breakfast of coffee and toast, then into the arduous task of restoration. I'd work until dusk, the rhythmic scrape of my wire brush or the clang of a dropped tool echoing eerily in the vast, hollow interior. In the evenings, I'd pore over my old maps, the familiar lines and contours a comforting counterpoint to the wild, untamed reality outside my new home. I cooked meager meals on a temperamental gas stove, the flame flickering like a nervous eye. Sleep, when it came, was deep and heavy, born of exhaustion. I told myself I was making progress. Each cleaned pane of glass, each scrubbed floorboard was a victory. The spire was just an old building, I reasoned, a collection of stone and iron succumbing to the elements. Any strange noises were the groan of settling timbers, the shriek of wind funneled through narrow vents, the relentless crash of waves against the rocks below. The building breathed, it sighed, it groaned. Like any old man's bones, I thought. Then came the subtle shifts, the almost imperceptible aberrations that began to chip away at my carefully constructed logic. It started with sounds. Not the obvious creaks and groans, but something softer, more deliberate. One afternoon, while I was wrestling a rusted iron bracket from a wall on the third level, I heard it. A faint, almost musical hum, like a distant, forgotten lullaby. It was brief, perhaps only a second or two, but distinct. I froze, a wrench heavy in my hand. The sound seemed to drift from the winding staircase above me, leading to the lamp room. I waited, straining my ears, but only the sighing wind and the distant cry of gulls answered. "Just the wind," I muttered, my voice sounding thin in the cavernous space, singing through a crack. A few days later, I was cleaning out an old storage closet near the base of the tower. The air was particularly stagnant in there, heavy with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet like old blood. As I knelt pulling out a pile of rotting canvas, I felt a sudden, intense chill, far colder than the ambient temperature of the spire. It was localized, directly behind my neck, and it felt like a breath. I spun around, my heart giving a clumsy thump against my ribs, but there was nothing. The closet was empty save for me and the debris. Draft! I scoffed aloud, trying to sound convincing. An unseen draft from some hidden vent. But the spire had no hidden vents. I'd meticulously documented every opening, every crack. My cartographer's eye missed nothing. The most unsettling incident occurred on a particularly foggy evening, the kind where the spire was completely enveloped, its base lost in an ethereal gray. I was in what had once been the keeper's study, a small room with a single, high window overlooking the churning sea. I was trying to repair a rickety wooden desk, my tools laid out in a neat row. I distinctly remembered placing my smallest screwdriver, a stubby little thing with a red handle, next to a loose drawer pull. I'd looked away for a moment, wrestling with a stubborn screw. When I looked back, the screwdriver was gone. I searched the desk, the floor, my pockets. It was a small room, nowhere for it to hide. I was certain I hadn't moved it. A flicker of annoyance, then frustration, began to bloom. I retraced my steps, my eyes scanning every inch of the floorboards. Nothing. Then hours later, long after I'd given up and resorted to using a knife blade in its place, I found it. It wasn't on the desk or the floor or even near where I'd been working. It was on a shelf above the fireplace, nestled neatly between two ancient, salt-warped books I hadn't even touched yet. My breath caught. I stared at the screwdriver, then at the shelf, then back at the screwdriver. My mind, usually so adept at logical deduction, spun in bewildered circles. I had not put it there. I couldn't have. I'd been focused, meticulous. I'd been researching obscure navigation routes for a client, poring over microfiche, surrounded by the hushed reverence of forgotten knowledge. I'd found a local gazetteer, bound in brittle leather, detailing the history of this very stretch of coast. There were brief, almost dismissive mentions of the spire, its keepers, and the strange occurrences that often led to their abrupt departures, or in some cases, their unexplained disappearances. I remembered scoffing then, too. It was folklore, a way to add color to a mundane historical record. One entry in particular had stuck with me, describing a keeper who claimed his tools would walk away on their own, only to reappear in impossible places. I dismissed him as an old man driven mad by solitude. Now, standing in the spire, staring at my red-handled screwdriver on a dusty shelf, the memory was no longer a quaint anecdote. I picked up the screwdriver. It felt normal, solid, tangible. But the way it had moved, the sheer impossibility of its relocation, was a physical shock. My logical mind scrambled for an explanation. Fatigue, sleep deprivation, a momentary lapse of memory. I was alone here. There was no other explanation. I had to have put it there. I must have. But as I stood there, the fog outside pressing against the window like a blind, hungry eye, I couldn't quite make myself believe it. It was a feeling of being watched, of not being quite so alone after all. And that feeling, unlike the wind, wasn't going to simply blow away. I was in what I considered my study, a small alcove off the main living quarters, poring over my meticulous charts of the spire's inner structure. The fog outside was a thick, breathing wall, swallowing the very base of the lighthouse, leaving only the upper reaches to pierce the gray. A low, sustained moan like a ship's horn, but wrong. It resonated not through the air, but through the very stone beneath my feet, vibrating up into my chair, into my bones. It was a sound of profound desolation, rising and falling, impossibly deep, yet somehow thin and reedy at the same time. It didn't come from the sea or the wind or any machinery I'd installed. It came from within the spire, from the heart of its ancient, silent core. I slammed my palms flat against the desk, a desperate attempt to ground myself. My cartographer's mind, always seeking the logical explanation, scrabbled for purchase. A draft, resonant frequencies, but no, this was too visceral, too mournful. It felt like grief given voice, a sorrow so immense it had seeped into the very foundation of the building. I spent the rest of that night with a wrench in hand, tapping every pipe, checking every joint, listening for loose masonry. Nothing. The sound, once it had faded, left behind an echo that vibrated only in my ears, a phantom hum in the silence. After that, the subtle shifts became less subtle, more insistent. The air in the spire, even on the warmest days, often felt as if it had passed through an ice cave. Sometimes, a faint, acrid scent would drift through the upper levels, like damp earth mixed with something metallic, almost like old blood, though I dismissed it as rust from the ancient ironwork or decaying seaweed blown in from the rocks below. My internal compass, usually so steady, began to spin. Sleep became a fractured landscape of half-dreams and sudden, breathless awakenings. I'd wake to the feeling of being watched, a pressure on my chest, the distinct impression of a presence leaning over me, just out of sight in the gloom. My hand would dart out, grasping at empty air. But the feeling of something receding, drawing back into the stone, was unmistakable. My methodical nature, once my greatest strength, was turning against me. I began documenting not just the physical structure of the spire, but the anomalies. The precise times of the temperature drops, the duration of the phantom moans, the exact location where the metallic scent was strongest. My notebooks, once filled with precise measurements and architectural sketches, now contained frantic scrawls and increasingly desperate attempts at rationalization. Wind tunnel effect, structural fatigue, pressure differentials. Each explanation felt thinner than the last, a flimsy veil against the encroaching absurdity. Grant, I'd murmur, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the vast space. Your mind playing tricks. But even as I said it, a part of me knew it was a lie. Then came the knock. I was on the lower landing, checking the integrity of a corroded railing when I heard it. 3 sharp, authoritative raps on the heavy oak door that led into the spire's base. My breath caught. I hadn't had a visitor since I arrived, not a single soul. I opened the door to find the local constable standing on the worn flagstones, his uniform crisp, his face stern. He introduced himself, his voice a low rumble. He mentioned concerns, reports of unusual activity, and a general welfare check on the new keeper. He didn't elaborate, but I knew what he meant. My own increasingly erratic behavior, perhaps. He asked me to come with him, just for a chat down at the station. I hesitated, wanting to refuse to barricade myself in the spire, but his quiet insistence held a subtle weight I couldn't ignore. I locked the heavy door behind me, the click of the latch echoing in the sudden quiet, and followed him. The drive was silent, the constable's presence a stark reminder of the world beyond the spire's isolated rock. He took me to a squat stone building nestled in the small coastal town. It wasn't a grand place, just a few offices and a holding area. He led me through a narrow corridor, past a couple of closed doors and into a room. "Wait here, Grant," he said, his voice softer now. "I just need to file some paperwork. Won't be long." He flicked on a dim overhead light, and then the heavy door clicked shut behind me. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, a different kind of mustiness than the spire, but equally heavy. Rows of metal shelving lined the walls, crammed with worn volumes, Legal texts, tattered fiction, local histories, all covered in a fine layer of neglect. A single, scarred wooden table stood in the center of the room, surrounded by 4 mismatched chairs. My mind, still buzzing from the constable's visit, searched for a distraction. My cartographer's instinct, always drawn to information, pulled me towards the shelves. I began to browse, my fingers tracing the spines of forgotten books. Most were mundane, but then, tucked away on a lower shelf behind a row of outdated almanacs, I found a small collection of leather-bound journals. They were unlabeled, faded, and clearly not meant for general circulation. I pulled one out. Its cover was cracked, the leather dry and brittle beneath my touch. I carried it to the table, the dust motes dancing in the weak light. The first few pages were blank or indecipherable, but further in, the script became clearer, though faded. The dates stretched back over a century. My breath hitched as I started to read. The entries began innocently enough, notes on weather, supplies, the maintenance of the lamp. It sinks into the bones, defies the fire. An entry from 1887. Heard it again tonight. A wail, not the wind, from inside. From 1902. And then a series of entries growing increasingly frantic, the handwriting slanting wildly across the page. They watch. And beneath it, a single repeated phrase scrawled over and over until the ink bled into the paper. It feeds on sorrow. It wasn't just my imagination. It wasn't the isolation. This wasn't unique to me. Other keepers, long dead and forgotten, had experienced the same malevolent presence. The spire wasn't just a building, it was a hungry maw, and I was its latest meal. The constable's return, the click of the door, startled me so badly I nearly dropped the journal. The cold dread that had bloomed in my chest at the spire didn't dissipate. If anything, it settled deeper, a permanent resident beneath my ribs. It wasn't just my imagination, not anymore. The moans, the cold, the creeping sense of being watched, these weren't unique to me. The thought gnawed at me, a relentless current against my usual tide of logic. I needed answers. One such contact, a stoic woman named Elena who managed the Regional Historical Society, had after much persuasion granted me special access to the local archives. My cover story about researching the architectural evolution of coastal lighthouses was thin, but effective enough. The name alone sent a shiver down my spine as I pushed open the heavy oak door. It wasn't a literal prison, of course, but the building had once served as the county's primary correctional facility, its library now repurposed for public records. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile, unforgiving glow on rows of towering shelves. I found the section Elena had pointed me towards, Coastal Infrastructure Maritime Records. It was a dusty corner, filled with ledgers bound in cracking leather, brittle newspaper clippings yellowed with time, and thick, official-looking reports. I pulled a chair to a heavy oak table, its surface scarred with generations of forgotten stories, and began. My fingers, usually so precise with maps and compasses, trembled slightly as I opened the first logbook. It belonged to a keeper named Silas Blackwood, dated 1888. His early entries were mundane, weather observations, supply inventories, notes on passing vessels. But around the 3rd year, a shift began. His handwriting grew erratic, sprawling across the page. I remember her. Silas Blackwood vanished a week later. The official report tucked into the ledger listed him as lost at sea. No body, no trace. My own experiences echoed in those words, the feeling of something wanting something. I moved on, flipping through brittle newspaper archives. A headline from 1907 screamed, "Lighthouse Keeper's Madness. Jeremiah Finch found raving, chained to spire railing." The article detailed how Finch, after years of solitary service, had been discovered by a supply boat crew, babbling incoherently about the eye of the tower and the deep, hungry breath. He'd clawed at his own face, leaving grotesque furrows, had to be forcibly removed. He died in a local infirmary a few months later, still catatonic. I pulled my jacket tighter, trying to rationalize it as a draft, but the library was sealed tight. Another keeper, a woman named Alara Vance in 1932. Her personal journal, miraculously preserved, spoke of a presence that mimics sorrow. She wrote about visions of her deceased mother, so vivid he could almost touch them, and the constant pull to the edge to join the waves. Her final, shaky entry, "The spire demands its due." I see her face in the fog. She calls to me. Alara Vance was found at the base of the lighthouse, her body broken against the rocks. The verdict, suicide, but her journal implied a force, a manipulation. My heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This wasn't just a pattern of unfortunate accidents or the toll of isolation. This was a consistent, insidious campaign. It was like reading my own future laid out in crumbling ink. I flipped through it, noting the alarming frequency of premature departures, mental incapacitation, and unexplained disappearances. The spire had claimed more than a dozen souls, then a small, unassuming folder tucked away at the bottom of a box marked miscellaneous. Inside were loose, faded sketches and notes, seemingly from various hands but all depicting the same thing. A stylized, almost predatory eye, drawn crudely, often with tendrils of smoke or fog curling around it. And beneath many of these drawings, a single recurring phrase scrawled in different penmanship but always the same words. "It remembers what you forget." My breath hitched. My own sister. The memories I clung to, the ones I fought to keep from fading. Was this what it fed on? My despair, my grief, my struggle to hold onto the past. The spire wasn't just a place. It was a hungry entity, a malevolent consciousness that preyed on the vulnerable, twisting their memories, driving them to their breaking points. It wasn't in the pages. It wasn't the building. I remembered the way my sister's face had seemed to shimmer in the fog. I wasn't just investigating a history. I was staring into a mirror, and what looked back was a reflection of every man and woman who had stood where I now stood, their sanity slowly eroded by an unseen, unspeakable horror. The spire wasn't just dilapidated, it was cursed, and I was its newest keeper. The revelation had been a punch to the gut, leaving me gasping for air in the oppressive quiet of the spire. My sister. Her memory, my grief, it wasn't just in here. It was what this place wanted. Sleep became a forgotten luxury. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every creak of the old structure a whisper of accusation. I ate little, the food tasting like ash. My hands shook constantly, and my reflection in the polished brass of the lamp mechanism showed a stranger. Gaunt, eyes bloodshot, framed by a week's worth of stubble. I tried to focus, to find an answer in the old keeper's logs I'd salvaged, but the faded ink swam before my eyes. The words blurred into meaningless squiggles, then terrifyingly into my sister's face, her smile twisting into a silent scream. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of brine, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood and dying flowers. I'd bolt upright from fitful dozing, convinced I heard my name called, a long, drawn-out syllable that seemed to echo from the very stones of the tower. But when I strained my ears, there was only the mournful groan of the wind and the ceaseless crash of waves below. One afternoon, a particular shudder ran through the spire, not from the wind, but from deep within its foundations. A low thrum vibrated up through the floorboards, rattling the teacup on my desk. I watched, transfixed, as a heavy brass telescope, usually secured, slowly, deliberately turned on its pivot, pointing directly at me. Its lens, like a vacant eye, seemed to bore into my very soul. I stumbled back, knocking over my chair. It wasn't human. It was ancient, malicious, and utterly devoid of warmth. Then a single heavy volume from the stack of keeper's logs I'd been trying to decipher slid off the desk, landing with a sickening thwack at my feet. It lay open, not to a random page, but to a crude, faded drawing of the lighthouse, its light beam replaced by a gaping maw. Beneath it, scrawled in a hand I didn't recognize, were two words, "Your sister." That was when the world around me began to fray. The rough-hewn stone walls of my study shimmered, losing their solidity. The familiar scent of salt and decay shifted, replaced by something sterile and stagnant like stale paper and forgotten dust. The sound of the waves receded, swallowed by an unnerving quiet. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but the transformation held. I was no longer in the spire. I was standing between towering shelves of books, their spines a uniform, dull gray or faded brown. The air was cool, dry, carrying the unmistakable scent of aged paper and institutional disinfectant. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low, insistent buzz overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on the rows of silent knowledge. The silence was profound, broken only by that relentless hum. My footsteps echoed unnaturally on the linoleum floor as I moved, my mind racing, trying to grasp how I'd come to be here. I reached out, my fingers tracing the worn spines of books on criminal law, forgotten histories, and tattered novels. Each touch sent a jolt of static up my arm. The titles were mundane, yet they seemed to stare back, judging. Nothing, just the endless rows of books stretching into the dim corners of the vast room. I spun, my heart leaping into my throat. It pulsed, a slow, deliberate beat like a monstrous, invisible heart. Then one by one their pages began to ripple, turning themselves with an eerie, rustling sound, faster and faster, a whirlwind of paper. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears, but felt in the marrow of my bones, a vibration that threatened to shatter my skull. The books on the shelves around me exploded outwards, paper shrapnel flying, their contents scattering like confetti. A searing pain lanced through my temples, and I dropped to my knees, clutching my head. Through the dizzying haze, I saw it, not with my eyes, but with a terrifying clarity that bypassed sight. A vast, hungry presence, not a shape, but an absence that swallowed all light, all warmth, all hope. It wasn't just feeding on my despair. It was consuming me, systematically dismantling my sanity, memory by memory, brick by brick. We are you. The heavy keeper's log still lay open at my feet, the drawing of the spire with its gaping maw staring up at me. My head throbbed, a dull, insistent ache. The air was thick with the metallic, sweet stench. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely push myself up. The entity had been here in my mind, in the very fabric of my perception. It wasn't just influencing me. It was inside me, using my own consciousness as its playground, and it had made its intentions undeniably clear. I was its next meal. My head throbbed, a dull, insistent drumbeat behind my eyes. The cold stone of the study floor pressed against my cheek, rough and unforgiving. Disorientation clung to me like a shroud. The next, the flickering fluorescent hum and the oppressive quiet of that place had dissolved, and I was back, truly back, in the Whispering Spire. I pushed myself up, my limbs protesting with a dull ache. The heavy keeper's log lay open at my feet, the unsettling drawing of the spire with its gaping maw staring up, almost mocking me. The image of the library, the stark cells, the crushing sense of isolation, it still felt too real, a phantom limb of memory. Had I fallen asleep? Had it been a dream or something far worse, a deliberate intrusion into my mind? I staggered to my feet, bracing a hand against my desk. The room was still, save for the distant sigh of the sea against the rocks. The scent of salt and damp stone was familiar, grounding. I needed air, a moment of clarity. I moved towards the study door, intending to descend the winding stairs, perhaps even step outside into the fog. I reached for the iron handle, my fingers closing around the cold metal. I twisted. It didn't budge. I tried again, a little more force. Nothing. The handle was firm, unyielding. I pulled, pushed, rattled it with growing frustration. It was locked, a knot tightened in my gut. I hadn't locked it. I never locked it. I didn't even have a key for this door, not that I knew of. My initial annoyance morphed into a prickle of unease. "What the hell?" I muttered, pressing my ear against the thick wood. Silence. I moved to the window, hoping for some external explanation. The panes were thick, grimy with sea salt. I tried to push one open, but it was sealed tight, painted shut with layers of old lead paint. I tried another, then another. Each one was an immovable barrier cemented into place by decades of neglect, and it seemed deliberate intent. This wasn't just a sticky door or a painted window. This felt intentional. I left the study, moving with a quickening pulse down the spiral staircase, my footsteps echoing unnervingly in the stone shaft. I reached the ground floor, my eyes sweeping over the familiar, decaying space. The main entrance. The massive oak door reinforced with bands of rusted iron, my last hope for an easy exit. I lunged for the heavy brass knob, twisting it with all my strength. It turned, but the door didn't give. I shoved against it, then pulled, straining until my muscles burned. The wood was solid, immovable. It was bolted from the outside, or perhaps from the inside by something other than human hands. I pounded on the door, a desperate, futile rhythm against the unyielding wood. "Hello, is anyone out there?" My voice sounded thin, swallowed by the vast, echoing space. Only the wind answered, a mournful keen from the distant shore. I was trapped, physically, undeniably trapped within the spire, not the wind, not the sea. These were softer, closer, like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor just at the edge of hearing. They formed no discernible words, just a constant, sibilant murmur, like 1,000 dry mouths breathing secrets. My skin prickled. Was it just my mind playing tricks? The psychological impact of my confinement, that feeling was here now, intensifying. Then a new sound, a faint, almost imperceptible scratching. It came from somewhere above me, perhaps from the upper levels, or even the lantern room itself. It sounded like fingernails dragging across stone, or something trying to scrape its way in or out. My determination, which had been a steady flame, now flickered under the onslaught. The entity wasn't just lurking anymore. It was actively pressing in, trying to break me. A wave of profound sadness washed over me, not my own, but like an echo, a psychic residue of all the despair this place had absorbed. I saw her face then, my sister's, clear as day, smiling sadly, her eyes full of a pain I hadn't been able to alleviate. This was its game, to drown me in the very emotions I sought to escape, to feed on my guilt, my fear, my loneliness, to make me believe there was no escape, no hope. I wouldn't let it. I was a man of logic, of maps and measurements. This thing, whatever it was an anomaly, a problem to be solved. Trapped or not, I would not surrender. I would find a way. I would fight. Disorientation clung to me like a shroud. I pushed myself up, my muscles screaming in protest. My vision then slowly sharpened, resolving the cavernous space around me. This wasn't the study in the lighthouse, not really. The shelves here towered, impossibly high, disappearing into a gloom where the ceiling should have been. Every surface was coated in a fine, gray dust, ancient and undisturbed. Rows upon rows of leather-bound books, their spines cracked and faded, lined the walls like silent, watchful sentinels. The air was heavy still, as if no breath had stirred it in centuries. A chill, deeper than the stone's cold, seeped into my bones. It was a pervasive, clinging sensation, like walking into a tomb where the last occupant had died in terror. It was here, whatever it was. This was its inner sanctum, or at least a projection of it, a place where it felt most at home. I stumbled forward, my hand brushing against a shelf. The books felt brittle, their covers like dried skin. A title, half obscured by dust, caught my eye, The Keeper's Lament. I pulled it free, the ancient binding groaning. The pages were yellowed, brittle, filled with spidery, handwritten script. I couldn't make out the words, not clearly, but the sheer volume of these texts, each one a testament to a life, a struggle, overwhelmed me. Not actual voices, not really, but a resonance in the air, a multitude of thoughts brushing against my own. Fragments. Lost, forgotten, never sleep. They were like echoes bouncing off the walls of my mind, formless yet intensely personal. Each one carried a distinct undertone of profound sorrow, a lingering despair. These weren't just books. These were the remnants of the lighthouse's previous inhabitants, their final thoughts, their last agonies, somehow preserved, contained within this impossible space. "You've come to understand, haven't you, Grant?" The voice was not spoken aloud. It resonated directly in my skull, a low, guttural thrum that vibrated through my teeth. It was the same voice I'd heard in the spire, the one that had tormented me, but here it was stronger, clearer, its intent laid bare. The spire calls, always. It has called to many through the centuries. A shimmering distortion appeared at the far end of the library, coalescing from the gloom. Within its shifting form, I saw glimpses, a bearded old man, his eyes wide with madness, staring out at a storm. A young woman weeping, clutching a faded photograph. A figure, gaunt and skeletal, slumped against a lantern. My sister, their despair. A feast for me, for the spire, a beacon of sorrow drawing them in. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. You feed on it, the grief, the isolation. And their understanding, the voice rumbled a deep, satisfied vibration. When they finally grasped the truth of their plight, the utter futility, that is the sweetest offering. It was a psychic vampire then, not a ghost, not a demon in the traditional sense, but an entity that existed on the resonance of human suffering. The lighthouse wasn't just its home, it was its lure, its trap, a kind of metaphysical antenna attracting those already burdened by grief like me. My sister's death hadn't been an accident. It had made me vulnerable, drawn me to the spire, just as it had drawn all the others. You led me here. You came, Grant. You chose to inherit. You chose the isolation. You chose to dwell on your loss. Each thought, each memory, each moment of despair. It strengthens me. It builds the foundation of your new home. My new home, it wasn't just feeding, it was claiming, to make me a permanent fixture, another source of endless, agonizing memory to perpetuate its existence. You want to keep me here, to be another voice in this endless library of suffering. To be the keeper, yes, the voice affirmed almost gently, but with an underlying current of absolute, unyielding power. The ultimate keeper, bound to the spire, bound to me. Your despair will echo through the ages, a constant, beautiful song. I looked around at the towering shelves, the millions of forgotten lives bound within those brittle pages. Each book a soul, a memory, a flicker of agony feeding this thing. The spire wasn't just a lighthouse. It was a cage, and I, Grant, the cartographer who sought logic in every line and curve, was now utterly, terrifyingly lost on its most dangerous map. I felt my own memories beginning to fray at the edges, my resolve weakening. It was reaching into me, trying to pull me apart, to consume the very essence of what made me me. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a desperate battle for my very existence. My heart hammered not from fear, but a frantic, desperate determination. I understood now. The spire wasn't just a physical place. It was a conduit, a focal point for this thing. And this library, filled with the discarded narratives and forgotten agonies of countless lives, was its secondary stomach, its feeding ground. I was meant to be the next meal, my sorrow a rich, potent vintage, but I wouldn't be. My gaze swept over the towering stacks, the shelves groaning under the weight of untold stories. Each brittle spine a life, each dusty page a memory. I remembered the old logbooks from the spire, the frantic, looping script of a keeper from centuries past. He'd scribbled something about the stillness, about patterns to quiet the echoes, before his entries dissolved into madness. I dismissed it then as the ramblings of a broken mind, but now a chilling clarity settled over me. He wasn't mad, he was describing a defense. My cartographer's mind, accustomed to imposing order on the chaotic sprawl of the world, clicked into gear. The entity thrived in the undefined, the forgotten, the chaotic swirl of uncatalogued despair. It fed on the absence of clarity. The spire, with its beam cutting through the fog, was about bringing things into focus, about definition. And I, Grant, would define this thing, bind it with the very order it despised. I needed tools. My satchel, miraculously still slung over my shoulder, held my travel compass, a precise metal instrument, and a small, well-used ruler. The silence wasn't empty. It was pregnant with watchful malice. A shiver traced its way down my spine, but I ignored it. I needed chalk. A quick, frantic search led me to a small supply closet where I found a box of white architect's chalk, thankfully unused. As I returned to the central aisle, the library seemed to shift. The entity knew. It sensed my intent to fight back, to starve it. "Not today," I murmured, my voice hoarse but firm. With the compass, I drew a perfect circle, then another intersecting it, forming a vesica piscis. Within that, I began to plot a complex geometric pattern, a star within a square, all connected by precise lines. It was a cartographer's ward, a symbolic map of containment, a boundary drawn not on paper, but in the very space it inhabited. "You couldn't save him, Grant, you failed." Images flashed behind my eyes, my sister's face pale and still, her laughter echoing from a distant, happier time. The entity was trying to break my focus, to drown me in the very despair it sought to consume. You don't get me. A book flew off a shelf nearby, slamming into the wall with a sickening thud, pages scattering like startled birds. Another followed, and another, until a cascade of forgotten histories rained down around me. I kept drawing, my movements precise, deliberate. Each line I etched was a defiance, each angle a boundary. I was mapping its prison, defining the limits of its power. I remembered the keeper's log. The stillness is not an absence, but a presence. The entity's attacks grew more desperate. My sister's voice, clear and heartbreaking, cried out my name, begging for help. I squeezed my eyes shut for a fraction of a second, fighting the urge to respond, to succumb. This was its strongest weapon, my grief, my guilt. "A trick," I gasped, the words tearing from my throat. Just a trick. I opened my eyes and focused on the chalk line, on the next precise measurement. The final lines of the pattern began to emerge. A central point, a core of stillness, around which the chaotic energies would be forced to orbit, to be contained. I leaned in, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my entire body screaming with the effort, both physical and mental. With a final, trembling stroke, I completed the pattern. The library went silent. The scattered books lay still. Flickering bulbs shone steadily. The air, though still smelling of old paper, was no longer thick with menace. I lay there, collapsed beside my chalk drawing, my chest heaving, listening to the sudden, profound quiet. Had it worked? Had I truly bound it or merely angered it further? A cartographer's cage. The stillness was there, palpable, but it felt precarious, fragile. A single breath, a single misplaced memory could shatter it. I had built a wall, but for how long would it hold? It was a sound I'd grown accustomed to. A constant low thrum that replaced the roar of the ocean and the shriek of the wind through the spire. I sat at a long, scarred table, a single bare bulb casting a stark circle of light on the worn wood. My fingers, still stained with what felt like phantom chalk dust, traced the grain. I remember the final lines. Each stroke was deliberate, a binding word in a language older than any text in this room. The pattern had pulsed, not with light, but with an internal pressure, a sudden, terrible stillness that sucked the air from my lungs. The chaotic energies, the whispers that had driven men mad, the despair that had felt like a physical weight on my soul, they had recoiled. I felt them compress, shrivel, not into nothingness, but into a dense, silent core. It was like watching a storm collapse in on itself, leaving behind an impossible vacuum. The relief was a sudden, dizzying plunge into silence. For a moment, I stood in the heart of the spire, utterly alone. Then the world tilted. I woke to the insistent prodding of a boot against my ribs, the harsh beam of a flashlight in my eyes. The faces above me were grim, unfamiliar. A local officer, a burly man whose name I never learned, stared down at me with a mixture of fear and disgust. "He's alive," he muttered to a colleague. "Just barely." They found me slumped amidst the chalk dust, muttering about patterns and containment. They didn't understand. How could they? They saw a man alone in a desolate lighthouse, surrounded by strange markings, babbling about forces unseen. They saw madness, that was the cost. He thinks I'm writing a memoir, a confession of my breakdown. He gives me paper, pens, and the quiet solitude I crave. But I'm not writing a memoir. I'm drawing. The chalk is gone, replaced by a dull pencil, but the compulsion remains. I draw the pattern again and again on scraps of paper, on the margins of discarded books. The central point, the orbiting lines, the containment, it's a ritual, a reassurance, because the victory I've come to understand was not absolute. The entity is contained, that much is true, but the despair it fed on, the memories it twisted, they still exist. And in that final, terrible compression, when the entity became a core of stillness, it didn't vanish, it simply shifted. I contained it, yes. I drew the lines, I created the vessel, but the vessel was me. A subtle shift in the air around me that no one else could detect. It's something far more insidious. A profound, aching emptiness that feels like my own, yet isn't. I reach for a fresh sheet of paper, my pencil poised. My hand trembles slightly, then the lines, precise and deliberate, forming the intricate cage. I am a cartographer, after all. I map what exists, and now I map the boundaries of what is contained within me. The tension never leaves. It's a low thrum beneath my skin, a constant vigilance. And the cost of my victory is an eternity of drawing these lines, of maintaining the containment, of wondering if one day the stillness within me will awaken and the spire will rise again, this time from the depths of my own despair. The warden thinks I'm finding peace, a way to process my trauma through art. He smiles kindly, leaves me to my work. He doesn't know that every line I draw is a ward, every sketch a desperate prayer,